Cold CEO had to marry the foundation director to access his trust fund. But when she stole his heart, money lost all its power. His empire was built on ice-cold calculations, but when her warm palm pressed against his in that moment of desperate vulnerability, billionaire CEO Jonathan Sterling realized that some equations couldn't be solved with money, only with a heart he'd forgotten he possessed. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The 62nd floor of Sterling Tower pierced the Seattle skyline like a glass dagger, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's-eye view of the city below. From his corner office, Jonathan Sterling surveyed his domain with the detached precision of a man who'd turned emotional distance into an art form. At 32, he commanded a business empire worth $3 billion, yet stood alone in a palace of his own making. Jonathan's reflection in the window showed a man carved from marble, sharp jawline, steel grey eyes, and perfectly styled dark hair that never dared fall out of place. His custom Tom Ford suit, worth more than most people's cars, fit his lean frame like armor. But armor, he'd learned long ago, was meant to keep things out as much as it was meant to protect what lay within. Mr. Sterling. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his morning ritual of watching the city wake up beneath him. Your attorney, Mr. Rothschild, is here for your 9 o'clock. Jonathan didn't turn from the window. Send him in. The oak doors whispered open, and Harold Rothschild entered with the careful steps of a man delivering terminal news. At 70, Harold had been the Sterling family attorney for 3 decades, had watched Jonathan transform from a grieving 10-year-old into the cold-blooded corporate predator he'd become. Jonathan. Harold's voice carried the weight of old friendship and older secrets. We need to discuss your grandfather's will. Again. This time, Jonathan did turn. His grandfather's will, that final, spiteful document that had haunted him for 2 years since the old man's death. Let me guess. The board is getting restless about the marriage clause. Harold settled into one of the leather chairs facing Jonathan's mahogany desk, his weathered hands clasping a manila folder that might as well have contained Jonathan's death sentence. The trustees are demanding action. You have 90 days to marry, or the trust fund, all $1.2 billion of it, goes to charity. Jonathan's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Of course it does. Even from the grave, the old bastard finds ways to control me. Jonathan. No. He moved to his desk with predatory grace, his fingers drumming against the polished surface. I've built Sterling Industries from the ground up. I don't need his money. Actually, you do. Harold opened the folder, revealing documents that made Jonathan's blood run cold. The expansion into European markets, the new tech acquisitions, the infrastructure investments, you've leveraged everything against that trust fund. Without it, you'll lose controlling interest in your own company within 6 months. The words hit Jonathan like bullets fired from his own gun. He'd been so focused on building his empire that he'd mortgaged his future against money he couldn't access. His grandfather's final checkmate, executed with the precision of a master chess player. There has to be another way. Harold's expression softened with something approaching pity. Marriage, Jonathan. It's the only way. And given your reputation with relationships, it would need to be someone who could make it believable. Someone with credibility, integrity. Someone the board would accept. Jonathan's reputation with women was legendary for all the wrong reasons. He collected supermodels and socialites like expensive watches, beautiful, temporary, and easily replaced when he grew bored. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness his enemies would exploit. I won't marry some gold digger who'll take half my assets in the divorce. What about a business arrangement? Someone who needs something you can provide. Someone who wouldn't want your money because she has her own mission, her own purpose. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Harold wasn't just throwing out random suggestions. He had someone specific in mind. Who? Amara Washington. The name hit the room like a lightning strike. Jonathan knew that name, had seen it in newspapers and business journals. Amara Washington, the 30-year-old director of the Washington Foundation, one of the most respected charity organizations on the West Coast. Beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely incorruptible. Everything Jonathan wasn't. The charity director. Jonathan's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and something else he couldn't quite name. She'd rather set herself on fire than marry someone like me. Harold smiled for the first time since entering the office. Not necessarily. Her foundation is facing a crisis. Government funding has been cut. Major donors are pulling out due to economic uncertainty. She's 60 days away from having to shut down programs that feed 10,000 families a week. Jonathan felt the familiar thrill of a hunt beginning. This wasn't about love or compatibility. This was business. How much does she need? 50 million to survive the year. 100 million to expand and secure her programs indefinitely. The numbers danced in Jonathan's mind like chess pieces falling into place. 50 million was pocket change to him, even in his current situation. But Amara Washington wasn't the type to be bought. She'd have to believe she was saving something bigger than herself. Set up a meeting, Jonathan said, his voice already carrying the cold calculation that had made him billions. Tell her Jonathan Sterling wants to discuss a mutually beneficial partnership. Harold rose, tucking the folder under his arm. Jonathan, I've known you since you were a boy. Your grandfather may have been a manipulative old fool, but he wasn't wrong about one thing. You've built walls so high around your heart that you can't see the sun anymore. The sun is overrated, Jonathan replied, turning back to his window. It burns things. What do you think Jonathan should do? Should he risk everything for a business marriage? Or is there another way out of his grandfather's trap? Let us know in the comments below. Meanwhile, across the city in the International District, Amara Washington stood in a food distribution center that smelled of hope and desperation in equal measure. Her orange blazer, bright as sunshine, her grandmother used to say, stood out like a beacon among the volunteers sorting canned goods and preparing meal packages. At 30, Amara possessed the kind of beauty that transcended physical appearance. Her dark skin glowed with the inner light of someone who'd found her purpose. Her natural hair was styled in elegant locks that framed her face, and her brown eyes held depths of compassion that could heal wounds just by witnessing them. But it was her presence that truly commanded attention, the way she moved through the world as if every person she met mattered, as if their problems were her problems. Miss Washington. A young volunteer approached hesitantly, tablet in hand. We're getting more families registering every day. The waiting list is now over 300. Amara's heart clenched, but her smile never wavered. We'll figure it out, Maria. We always do. But privately, she knew they were running out of miracles. The Washington Foundation had been her life's work, built from the ground up after she'd witnessed her own mother struggle to feed their family during her childhood. She'd sworn then that no child would go hungry on her watch. No family would face homelessness without someone fighting for them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Jonathan Sterling's office called. Wants to meet about partnership. Today at 2 p.m. if possible. Amara frowned at the screen. Jonathan Sterling. She knew the name, knew the reputation. Cold, ruthless, the kind of man who saw people as numbers on spreadsheets. What could someone like him possibly want with her foundation? But as she looked around at the faces depending on her, volunteers who believed in her mission, families who trusted her to keep fighting for them, she realized she couldn't afford to ignore any potential lifeline. Maria, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to lead through love rather than fear. I have a meeting this afternoon. Can you handle the 3 o'clock distribution? Of course, Miss Washington. What kind of meeting? Amara looked down at her phone again, at the name that represented everything she'd been raised to distrust. Wealth without conscience, power without purpose, success without soul. The kind that might save us all, she said softly, or destroy everything we've built. As she prepared to leave the warmth and purpose of her foundation for the cold steel and glass of Sterling Tower, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. She'd built her world on the foundation of helping others, of believing that love and compassion could solve any problem. She was about to meet a man who'd built his world on the opposite principle, that love was weakness, and the only thing that mattered was winning. Neither of them realized that their collision course would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about power, and about the difference between existing and truly being alive. The city hummed around them both, two souls moving toward a meeting that would either save them or destroy them, carrying the hopes and fears of thousands who depended on their choices. Sterling Tower's lobby was a cathedral of capitalism, all marble floors and soaring glass that made visitors feel appropriately small. Amara Washington stepped through the revolving doors at exactly 1:55 p.m., her orange blazer a splash of warmth against the building's sterile palette of greys and blacks. She'd chosen the color deliberately, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. When you walk into rooms full of people who don't expect you to belong, baby girl, you wear your light like armor. The elevator ride to the 60th floor felt like ascending to another planet. Each floor that flashed by on the digital display took her further from the world she knew, a world of community centers and food banks, of handwritten thank you notes and children's laughter echoing through hallways that smelled of hope and determination. Here, the only sound was the whisper of expensive air filtration systems and the distant hum of money being made. Jonathan's assistant, a woman whose smile was as perfectly calibrated as her pearl necklace, led Amara through corridors lined with original artwork that probably cost more than her foundation's annual budget. The deeper they walked into this temple of wealth, the more Amara felt like she was entering enemy territory. "Mr. Sterling will see you now," the assistant announced, opening doors that looked heavy enough to stop bullets. The office beyond took Amara's breath away, but not in the way Jonathan Sterling had intended. The space was vast, easily the size of her entire foundation office, with windows that offered a panoramic view of Seattle. But what struck her most was how empty it felt. Beautiful, expensive, and utterly devoid of human warmth. Jonathan stood with his back to her, silhouetted against those floor-to-ceiling windows like a figure carved from shadow and ambition. He didn't turn immediately, and Amara realized this was a power play. Make the visitor wait, establish dominance, control the room before the conversation even began. She'd grown up in rooms where such games were unnecessary, where respect was earned through service rather than intimidation. The silence stretched between them, and she found herself studying the man who'd summoned her to his tower in the sky. Even from behind, Jonathan Sterling radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt your place in the world. His suit was flawless, his posture perfect, his dark hair styled with the precision of someone who left nothing to chance. When he finally turned, Amara was struck by how young he looked. She'd expected someone older, more weathered by the weight of his reputation. Instead, she found herself looking into steel-grey eyes that held depths she hadn't expected. There was intelligence there, certainly, and the cold calculation she'd heard about. But underneath, barely visible, was something that looked almost like loneliness. "Ms. Washington." His voice was smooth as aged whiskey, carrying just the hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Sterling." She stepped forward, extending her hand with the confidence born of knowing her worth had nothing to do with the zeros in her bank account. "I have to admit, I'm curious about what someone like you wants with someone like me." His handshake was firm, brief, professional, but she caught the way his eyes flickered when their skin touched, as if the contact had surprised him somehow. "Please, sit." She chose the chair across from his desk rather than the couch arrangement by the windows, a subtle message that this was business, not a social call. Jonathan moved to his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, and for a moment they simply studied each other across the expanse of polished mahogany. "Your foundation," he began, "feeds how many families a week?" 10,000, she replied without hesitation. "We also provide job training, childcare, educational programs, and emergency housing assistance." Impressive. But his tone suggested he was calculating costs rather than celebrating impact. "And your funding situation?" Amara's spine stiffened. She'd researched Jonathan Sterling on the drive over, knew his reputation for acquiring struggling companies, stripping them down, and rebuilding them in his own image. "If you're looking to buy us out, Mr. Sterling, I'm afraid you've wasted both our time. The Washington Foundation isn't for sale." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his grey eyes. "What if I told you I wanted to save it instead? I'd ask what you wanted in return." The directness of her response seemed to catch him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "Most people dance around the real conversation for at least 20 minutes. I'm not most people." "No," he said quietly, "I'm beginning to see that." Jonathan rose and moved to the windows, and Amara found herself watching the way he moved, controlled, precise, but with an undercurrent of restless energy that suggested the stillness was learned rather than natural. "What do you know about trust funds, Ms. Washington?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "I know they are problems I've never had to worry about. My grandfather left me $1.2 billion, he said, still facing the window, with one condition." Amara waited, sensing that whatever came next would explain why she was sitting in this glass palace instead of down in her foundation, where she belonged. "I have to be married within 90 days, or the money goes to charity." She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Now he turned, and the look in his eyes was pure business, cold, calculating, devoid of emotion. "I need a wife, Ms. Washington. Temporarily. And you need funding for your foundation. I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement." The words hit her like ice water. Amara sat frozen, trying to process what she was hearing. "You're asking me to marry you?" "I'm proposing a business contract," he corrected, moving back to his desk with predatory focus. 12 months of marriage, completely platonic, with enough compensation to secure your foundation's future indefinitely. "How much compensation?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately hated herself for asking. $100 million. The number hung in the air between them like a physical presence. $100 million, enough to expand every program, feed every hungry family, house every homeless person who walked through their doors. Enough to turn her small foundation into a force that could change thousands of lives. But the price? "Let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "You want me to marry you, pretend to be your loving wife for a year, so you can access your inheritance." "The loving part is optional," he replied with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to consider love as anything more than a business transaction. "Though the board would expect us to appear compatible in public." Amara stood abruptly, her orange blazer bright as a flame against the office's muted tones. "Mr. Sterling, I think you've confused me with someone else. Someone who would sell herself for money, no matter how much good that money could do." "Sit down." The command in his voice was absolute, but Amara had been taking orders from men who thought money made them gods since she was old enough to understand what poverty meant. "I don't think so." "Sit down." This time, there was something else in his voice, not anger, but something rawer. "Please." The please surprised her enough that she hesitated, and in that hesitation, she saw something crack in his carefully maintained facade. "You think I want this?" he asked, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, Jonathan Sterling sounded human. "You think I want to beg a woman I've never met to pretend to love me so I can keep what's mine?" "Then why?" "Because I don't have a choice." The words erupted from him with surprising force. "Because my grandfather, even from the grave, found a way to control my life. Because everything I've built, everything I've worked for, will disappear if I don't play his games." Amara sank back into her chair, not because he'd commanded it, but because something in his voice, the raw pain beneath the anger, made her want to understand. "Why me?" Jonathan's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Because you're everything I'm not. Good. Pure. Someone the board would believe could actually love a bastard like me, even temporarily. You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." He moved to a file cabinet, withdrawing a folder thick enough to contain her entire life story. Amara Washington, born in Tacoma to a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep you fed. Scholarship to University of Washington. Graduated summa cum laude with degrees in social work and business administration. Started the Washington Foundation at 25 with a $10,000 loan you paid back in 6 months. No criminal record, no scandals, no ex-husbands hiding in your past. Each fact hit her like a violation, proof that he'd investigated her life with the thoroughness of someone who left nothing to chance. "You had me followed. I had you researched. There's a difference." "Is there?" For a moment, something almost like shame flickered across his features. "I needed to know if you were someone I could trust." "Trust?" Amara's voice rose, carrying the weight of a lifetime spent watching powerful men use and discard the people who depended on them. "You want to trust me, But you're asking me to lie to the world about who I am, what I feel, what I believe in. I'm asking you to save 10,000 families a week, he shot back. I'm asking you to think about what $100 million could do for the people who need you. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Jonathan Sterling might be a cold-blooded predator, but he understood leverage. He'd found her weakness, her absolute, unwavering commitment to the people she served, and he was using it against her with the skill of a master manipulator. Do you think Amara should accept Jonathan's proposal to save her foundation? What would you do if faced with such an impossible choice? Share your thoughts in the comments. 1 year, she said quietly, not quite believing the words were coming from her mouth. 1 year. Separate bedrooms. No physical contact beyond what's necessary for public appearances. Agreed. I continue running my foundation exactly as I see fit. No interference from you or your people. Done. And when the year is over, clean divorce. No contests, no complications. Jonathan nodded, but something in his expression suggested the simplicity she was imagining might not be as clean as either of them hoped. One more thing. Amara's stomach dropped. In her experience, one more thing was usually where deals revealed their true price. What? We'll need to live together. Maintain separate residences would raise questions. The thought of sharing space with this man, this beautiful, dangerous stranger who saw people as chess pieces, made her skin crawl. But she thought of Maria and the other volunteers, of the families lined up outside their doors every morning, of the children who depended on her foundation for their next meal. Your place or mine? She asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Mine. More believable that you'd move into my world than I'd move into yours. Of course. Even in compromise, Jonathan Sterling had to maintain control. When would this arrangement begin? The paperwork can be ready by tomorrow. We could be married by the end of the week. The speed of it all made her head spin. That's very fast. I don't have time for a long engagement, Ms. Washington. Neither do your families. He was right, and they both knew it. Every day she delayed was another day her foundation moved closer to closing its doors. But the thought of binding herself legally to this man, even temporarily, felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. I need time to think. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I'll need to pursue other options. Other options. Other women willing to sell a year of their lives for the right price. The thought shouldn't have bothered her, but it did. Amara stood, smoothing her blazer with hands that trembled only slightly. If I agree to this, Mr. Sterling, I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this for you. I'm not doing this for your money, or your inheritance, or your grandfather's twisted games. I'm doing this for people who have no other choice. I wouldn't expect anything else. But as she moved toward the door, his voice stopped her. Ms. Washington. She turned back, and for just a moment, saw past the calculating mask to something almost vulnerable underneath. What happens if we actually start to like each other? The question caught her completely off guard. Of all the complications she'd considered, the lies, the public scrutiny, the year of pretending to be someone she wasn't, genuine connection hadn't been one of them. That won't happen, she said, as much to convince herself as him. How can you be so certain? Amara met his gaze directly, letting him see the steel beneath her compassion. Because I know exactly what you are, Mr. Sterling. And you know exactly what I am. Oil and water don't mix, no matter how long you shake the bottle. She left him standing in his glass tower, surrounded by wealth and power and the echoing emptiness of a life built on everything except the things that actually mattered. As the elevator carried her back down to street level, back to the world where love wasn't a transaction and marriage wasn't a business deal, Amara wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. But when she stepped outside and saw a homeless man digging through a trash can while business people in expensive suits walked past without seeing him, she knew she didn't really have a choice at all. Some sacrifices were worth making, even if they cost you pieces of your soul. The marriage certificate felt like a death warrant in Amara's hands as she signed her name in the courthouse conference room. The pen, an expensive Mont Blanc that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, felt foreign against her fingers, each letter of her signature sealing a fate she still couldn't quite believe she'd chosen. 3 days. That's all it had taken to transform from foundation director to billionaire's wife. 3 days of lawyers and prenuptials, of background checks and media statements, of Jonathan Sterling's efficient machine turning her life into a carefully orchestrated performance. Mrs. Sterling. Judge Patricia Coleman, a woman whose kind eyes seemed to see through the careful facade they'd constructed, smiled warmly as she pronounced them husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The words hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment Amara had been dreading, the first real test of whether they could sell this illusion to a world that would be watching their every move. Jonathan moved closer, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her heart skip in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the terrifying realization that she was now legally bound to this stranger. Just a kiss, he murmured, so low only she could hear. For the cameras. She nodded, acutely aware of the court photographer Harold had insisted on. For authenticity, he'd said, and the handful of witnesses required to make this legal. Jonathan's hands came up to frame her face with surprising gentleness, his thumbs brushing against her cheekbones in a gesture that felt far too intimate for what was supposed to be pure theater. When his lips touched hers, Amara's entire world shifted on its axis. She'd expected cold calculation, a perfunctory press of lips that would satisfy the legal requirements and nothing more. Instead, she found warmth, softness, and something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, but in those seconds, Amara glimpsed something in Jonathan Sterling that his reputation had never hinted at. Vulnerability, carefully hidden but unmistakably real. When they broke apart, his eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and she saw her own confusion reflected in their grey depths. This was supposed to be business. Simple, clean, emotionless business. So why did her lips still tingle with the memory of his touch? Congratulations, Judge Coleman said, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. I hope you'll be very happy together. Happy. The word felt like a joke as they signed the final paperwork and posed for photos that would convince the world they'd married for love instead of leverage. Happy was what Amara had felt working with families at the foundation, seeing children's faces light up when they received backpacks full of school supplies. Happy was not whatever this complicated arrangement would become. The ride to Jonathan's penthouse in his Bentley was conducted in silence, the space between them on the leather seats feeling simultaneously too small and impossibly vast. Seattle flowed past the tinted windows like a movie neither of them was particularly interested in watching. Second thoughts? Jonathan asked as they pulled into the underground garage of his building. Third and fourth thoughts, Amara admitted. You. I stopped counting at 12. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She'd expected Jonathan Sterling to approach this arrangement with the same cold confidence he brought to his business deals. Instead, he seemed as unsettled by their kiss as she was. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that probably cost more than her foundation's entire annual budget. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of Seattle, from the Space Needle to Elliott Bay, making her feel like she was living inside a jewelry box suspended in the sky. But what struck her most was how impersonal it felt. The furniture was expensive and beautiful, Italian leather, hand-carved wood, artwork that belonged in museums. But there were no photographs, no personal touches, no evidence that anyone actually lived here. It was a showroom, not a home. The guest room is down the hall, Jonathan said, setting down her single suitcase with the careful distance of a hotel concierge. You'll have your own bathroom, of course. The housekeeper comes twice a week, but she's signed a confidentiality agreement. Of course she has. Amara turned slowly, taking in the pristine surfaces and carefully curated beauty. Does anyone actually live here, or do you just use it for photo shoots? Something flickered across his features. Hurt, maybe, though it was gone too quickly to be sure. I live here. Do you? Or do you just exist here? The question slipped out before she could stop it, more personal than anything she'd intended to say. But something about this sterile perfection made her ache for the warmth and chaos of her foundation, where children's artwork covered the walls and the coffee pot was always on and every surface told a story of lives being changed. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Not everyone needs their walls covered with inspirational posters and thank you notes from grateful families. How do you know about? She stopped, remembering the thick file of research he'd compiled on her life. Never mind. I forgot that my privacy ended the moment I signed that prenup. Amara. The sound of her first name on his lips made something flutter in her chest, something she immediately tried to suppress. I didn't mean. It's fine. She picked up her suitcase, suddenly desperate to put space between them. We both know what this is. No need to pretend we're friends. But as she walked down the hallway toward what would be her prison for the next 12 months, she heard him call after her. For what it's worth, I think what you've built is remarkable. She didn't turn around, didn't trust herself to look at his face and see whether he meant it. Because if he did mean it, if there was genuine admiration behind those carefully controlled grey eyes, then this arrangement had just become infinitely more dangerous than a simple business transaction. The guest room was larger than her entire apartment, with a king-sized bed that could have slept a family of 4 and a view of the harbour that took her breath away. But it was also cold, impersonal, decorated in shades of cream and beige that revealed nothing about the man who owned this space. Amara unpacked her single suitcase slowly, hanging her few dresses in a walk-in closet designed for someone with 10 times her wardrobe. Her orange blazer looked lonely among all that empty space, a splash of color in a world designed to showcase wealth rather than personality. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. How did it go? The volunteers are asking when you'll be back. How could she possibly explain that she'd married a stranger to save their foundation? That she was now Mrs. Jonathan Sterling, living in a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Everything went according to plan, she texted back. I'll be in tomorrow to discuss our new funding situation. It wasn't a lie, exactly. Just an omission of everything that mattered. A soft knock on her door interrupted her unpacking. Come in. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, having changed from his wedding suit into jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. More human. I thought you might be hungry. I was going to order dinner. I can cook, she offered, then immediately regretted it. This wasn't her home, and he wasn't her husband, not really. I mean, if you have groceries. I don't want to assume. The kitchen is fully stocked, he said quietly. I don't really cook. Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. Jonathan Sterling, master of the universe, looked almost embarrassed by the admission. Never learned, or never had time. Never saw the point. There are restaurants, takeout, the housekeeper leaves meals prepared. But never the simple pleasure of creating something with your own hands, Amara realized. Never the satisfaction of feeding someone you cared about. Never the basic human connection that came from sharing a meal you'd made together. I make excellent pasta, she heard herself saying. Nothing fancy, but I'd like that. The words came out quickly, as if he was afraid she might change her mind. I'd like that very much. 30 minutes later, they sat at his dining room table, a slab of marble that could have seated 12, sharing bowls of her grandmother's spaghetti recipe while the city sparkled below them. The silence wasn't entirely comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the awkward quiet of 2 people trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without revealing too much of themselves. This is really good, Jonathan said, and the surprise in his voice was almost insulting. You sound shocked that I can cook. I'm shocked that someone can make food taste like. He paused, searching for words. Like comfort. The admission was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Amara nearly choked on her wine. Jonathan Sterling, the man who had everything money could buy, didn't know what comfort food tasted like. Didn't your mother cook for you? She asked gently. His fork stilled against his plate. My mother died when I was 10. After that, it was boarding schools and housekeepers and whatever my grandfather's staff prepared. The image hit her like a physical blow. A 10-year-old boy, lost and grieving, shipped off to institutions where love was a luxury no amount of money could purchase. No wonder he'd grown up seeing relationships as transactions, emotions as weaknesses to be controlled. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That must have been incredibly lonely. Jonathan's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Lonely? I had everything a child could want. The best schools, the finest clothes, more toys than I knew what to do with. But no one to read you bedtime stories. No one to make you soup when you were sick. No one to hug you when you were scared. The words hung between them like an accusation, and Amara immediately regretted her directness. She'd grown up with very little money but an abundance of love, her mother working 3 jobs but always making time for homework help and bedtime kisses. She couldn't imagine the emotional desert Jonathan had navigated as a child. "I survived," he said finally, but his voice carried the weight of everything he wasn't saying. Surviving isn't the same as living. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the careful walls they'd both constructed seemed paper-thin. Amara saw past his reputation to the wounded boy he'd been, while Jonathan saw past her idealism to the strength that had carried her through her own struggles. "This is dangerous," he said quietly. "What is?" "This. Getting to know each other. It wasn't part of the deal." He was right, and they both knew it. The arrangement worked because it was clean, clinical, transactional. The moment they started seeing each other as real people with real histories and real pain, everything became infinitely more complicated. "Maybe we should establish some ground rules," Amara suggested, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Such as, no personal questions. No sharing childhood stories. No. Moments like this." "Moments like what?" "Moments where I forget that you're Jonathan Sterling, ruthless CEO, and start seeing you as just Jonathan." The honesty of her admission seemed to surprise them both. Jonathan set down his fork, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "And what if I'm starting to forget that you're Amara Washington, Foundation Director, and seeing you as just my wife?" The word wife hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Technically, legally, she was his wife. But the way he said it carried implications that went far beyond their carefully negotiated contract. The lines between business and personal are already starting to blur. Do you think they are making a mistake by getting to know each other? Or is this connection exactly what they both need? Let us know what you think. That would be a mistake, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Would it? Before she could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The spell broke instantly, reality crashing back into their temporary bubble of domestic normalcy. Jonathan glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted back to the cold, controlled CEO she'd met in his office. I have to take this. Board member. As he stepped away to handle his business, Amara was left alone at the marble table, surrounded by the remnants of their first meal together and the uncomfortable realization that their carefully constructed arrangement was already showing cracks. She could hear his voice from the living room, crisp and authoritative as he handled whatever crisis required his immediate attention. This was his real world, late-night calls and emergency meetings and decisions that affected thousands of people's livelihoods. She was just a temporary addition to his life, a contractual obligation that would be resolved in 12 months. But when he returned to the dining room, his eyes found hers immediately, and the softness she saw there suggested that maybe, just maybe, she was already becoming something more than an obligation. Sorry about that, he said. Emergency with the Tokyo expansion. It's fine. I should probably call it a night anyway. Big day tomorrow, telling my team about our new funding. Amara. He caught her arm gently as she started to clear the dishes. Thank you. For dinner, for this. It's been a long time since this place felt like anything other than an expensive hotel room. The gratitude in his voice was so genuine, so unexpected, that it nearly undid her completely. She'd expected Jonathan Sterling to be arrogant, demanding, impossible to live with. She hadn't expected him to be grateful for something as simple as homemade pasta and conversation. You're welcome, she said softly, acutely aware of his hand still resting on her arm, of the warmth spreading from that point of contact through her entire body. They stood like that for a moment, neither moving away, both seeming to realize they were standing at a crossroads that would determine everything that came next. They could step back now, maintain the professional distance that would keep their hearts safe and their arrangement clean. Or they could step forward into territory that neither of them understood, where contract marriages became something messier and more dangerous and infinitely more real. Jonathan's thumb traced a small circle against her skin, and Amara's breath caught in her throat. Such a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it felt like the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to her. Good night, Jonathan, she whispered, pulling away before she did something they'd both regret. Good night, Amara. But as she lay in the enormous guest bed an hour later, staring up at the ceiling while the city lights painted patterns on the walls, Amara knew that sleep would be a long time coming. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonathan's face when he'd tasted her grandmother's recipe, the wonder in his expression as if he was experiencing comfort for the first time. Down the hall, she could hear him moving around his bedroom, and she wondered if he was having as much trouble sleeping as she was. Wondered if he was thinking about the way her hand had felt in his when they'd signed the marriage certificate, or the moment when their carefully constructed walls had briefly crumbled over dinner. Wondered if he was already regretting the ground rules they'd agreed to establish, the barriers they'd promised to maintain to keep this arrangement from becoming something neither of them was prepared to handle. Because if the first day of their marriage was any indication, the next 12 months were going to be the longest year of both their lives. 6 weeks into their marriage, Amara had developed a routine that kept her sane and her heart safely guarded. Wake up before Jonathan, make coffee in his ridiculously expensive kitchen, and escape to the foundation before he emerged from his bedroom looking rumpled and human and dangerously attractive in ways that had nothing to do with his wealth. But this Tuesday morning, her carefully constructed schedule shattered the moment she walked into the kitchen and found him already there, standing at the window with his phone pressed to his ear and fury radiating from every line of his body. "I don't care what the tabloids are saying," he snarled into the phone, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that made smart people step back. "Find out who's feeding them information and shut it down." Amara froze in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, as Jonathan's words registered. Tabloids. Information. Her stomach dropped as she realized that their carefully orchestrated facade might be crumbling. Jonathan ended the call with more force than necessary and turned to find her watching him. His hair was disheveled, his usually perfect shirt wrinkled, and his grey eyes held a wildness she'd never seen before. "What's wrong?" she asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Without a word, he handed her his phone. The screen showed a gossip website with a headline that made her blood run cold. Charity scam? Sterling's foundation wife accused of marrying for money. Below the headline was a photo of her leaving the foundation yesterday, but it wasn't the image that made her hands shake. It was the subheading. Exclusive. Former foundation employee claims Washington's marriage is fake, designed to access Sterling Trust Fund. "No," she whispered, scrolling through an article that dissected their relationship with surgical precision. Anonymous sources. Detailed timelines. Financial information that should have been confidential. Someone had sold their story, and they'd done it with enough accuracy to be devastating. "They know about the trust fund," Jonathan said, his voice flat as winter stone. "They know about your foundation's financial problems. They know this marriage happened exactly when my grandfather's deadline required it." Amara sank into one of his kitchen stools, the phone trembling in her hands as she read quote after quote from someone who claimed to know the truth about their arrangement. The worst part wasn't the accusations, it was how close to the truth they actually were. Who would do this? She asked, though her mind was already cycling through possibilities. Few people knew the intimate details of their situation, which meant the betrayal had come from someone close to one of them. "I don't know," Jonathan said, but something in his voice suggested he had suspicions. "My attorney is investigating, but the damage is already done. The board is meeting in emergency session this afternoon." The board. Amara had almost forgotten about the people who would ultimately decide whether their marriage satisfied his grandfather's requirements. If they decided the union was fraudulent, Jonathan would lose everything, and so would her foundation. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "I should have been more careful, should have." "Stop." Jonathan's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. "This isn't your fault. Someone targeted us deliberately, and they did it with information that could only have come from." He trailed off, but Amara saw the moment realization hit him. His face went pale, then flushed with a rage so pure it was almost beautiful. "Your assistant," she said, reading his expression. "She has access to your files, your calendar, your personal information." "Rebecca." The name came out like a curse. "She's been with the company for 5 years. I trusted her with everything." The betrayal hit Amara like a physical blow, not because she'd particularly liked Rebecca, they'd barely interacted, but because she recognized the look on Jonathan's face. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd learned that her first major donor had been embezzling money from the foundation. The hollow shock of discovering that someone you'd trusted had been selling you out all along. Why would she do this? Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Money. Someone paid her for our private information, and she delivered. It's that simple. But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. This wasn't just about money or betrayal, or even the public humiliation of having their private arrangement splashed across the internet. This was about the fact that their carefully constructed lie was about to cost them everything they'd worked for. What happens now? Amara asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Now we decide if we're going to fight or surrender. The words hung between them like a challenge. Fight meant admitting to the world that they'd entered a contractual marriage for financial reasons. Surrender meant Jonathan losing his company and Amara losing her foundation's funding. Either way, they were facing the destruction of everything that mattered to them. I can't ask you to lie for me, Jonathan said quietly. Not anymore. This has gone too far. What are you saying? He moved to the window, staring out at the city that had always been his kingdom and might soon become his former empire. I'm saying that maybe it's time to tell the truth. All of it. The truth. Amara's heart clenched as she realized what he was suggesting. The truth meant admitting to the board, to the media, to the world that their marriage was a business transaction. It meant watching him lose everything while she walked away with her foundation's funding intact. I won't let you do that, she said, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. Jonathan turned, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Why not? Because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, you stopped being a stranger and started becoming something else. Because I've seen you laugh at terrible movies and curse at the coffee maker when it doesn't work right. Because you ask about my day and remember the names of the families we help. Because you're not the cold, heartless bastard the world thinks you are. But she couldn't say any of that. Couldn't admit that their fake marriage had started feeling dangerously real. That she'd begun looking forward to their awkward dinner conversations and the way his face softened when he thought she wasn't watching. Because it's not fair, she said instead. You kept your end of the bargain. My foundation is thriving because of you. I won't watch you lose everything because someone decided to sell us out. Amara. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, and when he moved closer, she could see something in his eyes that made her breath catch. What if I told you that losing the company doesn't scare me as much as losing you? The words hit her like lightning, illuminating everything she'd been trying not to see. The way he looked at her over morning coffee. The gentle way he touched her hand when they walked together in public. The fact that their separate bedrooms had somehow become the most important boundary in a penthouse full of careful distances. Jonathan, don't. Her voice was barely a whisper. Don't say things you don't mean. What if I mean every word? He was standing close enough now that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the cologne that had become dangerously familiar over the past weeks. Close enough that if she moved just a few inches, she could find out if kissing him again would be as earth-shattering as their wedding kiss had been. This isn't real, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. We have a contract. An arrangement. In 6 months, we'll get divorced and go back to our separate lives. Will we? His hand came up to cup her cheek, and she couldn't help but lean into the touch. Because I've been living in this penthouse for 3 years, and it never felt like home until you started making dinner in my kitchen. Jonathan. I know you feel it too. His thumb traced along her cheekbone, and she had to close her eyes to keep from drowning in the tenderness of the gesture. I know you're not as immune to this as you pretend to be. He was right, and they both knew it. Somewhere between their first awkward dinner and their morning coffee routine, between his genuine interest in her foundation work and the way he'd started leaving little notes when he had to travel for business, she'd started falling for a man she was supposed to be pretending to love. It doesn't matter what I feel, she said, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. We made a deal. 1 year, then clean divorce. No complications. Fuck the deal. The words were so unexpected, so unlike the controlled man she'd married, that Amara gasped. Jonathan Sterling, master of contracts and negotiations, suggesting they ignore their carefully crafted agreement. You don't mean that. I mean every word. His other hand came up to frame her face, and she was trapped between his palms and the truth she could see burning in his eyes. I mean that I wake up every morning hoping you'll still be in the kitchen when I get downstairs. I mean that I've started scheduling meetings around your foundation events because I want to hear you talk about your day. I mean that I haven't looked at another woman since the moment you walked into my office wearing that blazer that made you look like sunshine. Each confession hit her like a physical blow, breaking down the walls she'd built around her heart one truth at a time. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to maintain professional distance, to keep their arrangement clean and uncomplicated and purely transactional. This is crazy, she whispered. Is it? Or is it the first sane thing either of us has done in years? Before she could answer, before she could think of all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, Jonathan leaned down and kissed her. Not the careful, calculated kiss from their wedding, but something raw and desperate and absolutely real. Amara's world exploded into sensation, the firm pressure of his lips, the way his hands tangled in her hair, the sound he made when she kissed him back with 6 weeks' worth of suppressed longing. This was what she'd been afraid of, this overwhelming connection that made their contract feel like a joke and their separate bedrooms feel like a prison. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me you don't feel this," he said. "Tell me this is just gratitude or convenience or anything except what I think it is." But she couldn't lie when his hands were still in her hair and his heart was pounding against her chest and she could still taste the coffee he'd been drinking on his lips. "This changes everything," she said instead. "Does it have to?" The question hung between them like a bridge to a future neither had planned for. A future where their marriage wasn't a business transaction, but a choice they made every day. Where the penthouse became a home instead of a prison. Where Jonathan Sterling, the man who'd built his life on emotional distance, learned to love and be loved in return. But before Amara could answer, before she could figure out if she was brave enough to cross that bridge, Jonathan's phone rang. The harsh sound shattered their moment like glass, dragging them back to the reality of tabloid exposés and board meetings and the fact that their world was currently falling apart around them. Jonathan glanced at the screen and his entire body tensed. "It's Harold. I have to take this." As he stepped away to answer his attorney's call, Amara pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the phantom pressure of his kiss. Everything had changed in the space of 5 minutes. Their careful arrangement, their professional distance, their plans for a clean divorce, all of it was crumbling under the weight of feelings neither had expected to develop. "The board wants to meet with both of us," Jonathan said when he ended the call. "Today. They want to hear our side of the story before they make any decisions about the trust fund." Our side. As if they were a team instead of 2 people bound by a contract that was looking more inadequate by the minute. "What will we tell them?" Amara asked. Jonathan's eyes met hers, and she saw her own confusion reflected in their grey depths. An hour ago, the answer would have been simple: stick to their story, maintain their professional facade, get through the meeting and the remaining 6 months of their arrangement. But an hour ago, they hadn't been standing in his kitchen confessing feelings that changed everything. An hour ago, Jonathan hadn't looked at her like she was the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask. An hour ago, she hadn't realized that somewhere along the way, she'd fallen completely, irreversibly in love with her fake husband. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever we tell them together." Together. The word carried implications that went far beyond their current crisis. It suggested a partnership that had nothing to do with trust funds and everything to do with the choice to face whatever came next as a united front. "Together," she agreed, and tried to ignore the way her heart soared when Jonathan smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him all morning. They had 3 hours before the board meeting. 3 hours to figure out how to save his company, her foundation, and whatever this thing was that had grown between them. 3 hours to decide if they were willing to fight for something neither had expected to want. As Jonathan disappeared to shower and change, Amara remained in the kitchen, staring out at the city that had become her home and wondering if she was brave enough to bet everything on a love that had started as a lie but had somehow become the most honest thing in her life. The tabloids thought they'd exposed a scandal. They had no idea they'd actually revealed a love story. The Sterling Industries boardroom felt like a courtroom as Amara and Jonathan entered together, their hands briefly touching as they passed through the mahogany doors. 12 faces turned toward them, some curious, some disapproving, all calculating the cost of the scandal that had exploded across every major news outlet that morning. Harold Rothschild sat at the far end of the conference table, his weathered face grave as he gestured for them to take seats at the opposite end. Between them stretched an ocean of polished wood and the combined judgment of people who measured worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. Jonathan. Mrs. Sterling. Board Chairman Robert Blackstone's voice carried the weight of old money and older prejudices. I think we can dispense with pleasantries. We're here because your marriage, the union that was supposed to fulfill your grandfather's requirements, has been called into question. Amara felt Jonathan tense beside her, but when she glanced at him, his face showed only the controlled calm that had made him legendary in boardrooms around the world. This was his element, his battlefield, and watching him prepare to fight for what mattered to them both made her heart ache with pride and terror in equal measure. The allegations are serious, continued board member Patricia Webb, her silver hair pulled back in a bun so severe it could have been a weapon. A contractual marriage designed specifically to circumvent your grandfather's intentions. If these claims are true, you've committed fraud against this board and your shareholders. And if they are false? Jonathan's voice was silk over steel. If someone has fabricated lies to damage both my reputation and my wife's charitable work, then you'll have no difficulty explaining the rather convenient timing of your wedding, Blackstone replied. 3 months before the trust fund deadline, to a woman you'd never met, who happened to need exactly the kind of financial assistance your marriage would provide. The facts, laid out so starkly, sounded damning even to Amara's ears. She could see the board members' expressions hardening, their minds already made up about the kind of people they thought they were dealing with. Before we begin, Harold interjected, sliding a tablet across the table toward Blackstone, I think you should see the latest development in this situation. Amara's stomach dropped. More revelations. More intimate details of their private arrangement splashed across the internet for the world to dissect. Blackstone's eyebrows rose as he read whatever was on the screen. This is unexpected. What is it? Jonathan's carefully controlled mask slipped slightly, revealing the anxiety he'd been hiding. Harold's expression was unreadable as he spoke. Rebecca Morrison has been arrested for corporate espionage and extortion. It appears she was being paid by Hartwell Industries to gather intelligence on Sterling's business practices. The marriage story was just a bonus, a way to create chaos and potentially force a hostile takeover while the board was distracted. The words hit the room like a bomb. Hartwell Industries, Sterling's biggest competitor, a company that had been circling like vultures for years, waiting for any sign of weakness. The FBI found evidence that Ms. Morrison has been selling confidential information for over a year, Harold continued. Your personal lives were just the latest commodity she decided to exploit. Amara felt something unclench in her chest. They hadn't been betrayed by someone close to them. They'd been targeted by corporate warfare that had nothing to do with their relationship and everything to do with the billions of dollars at stake. But Blackstone wasn't finished. This explains the source of the leak, but it doesn't address the fundamental question. Is your marriage legitimate, or is it a business arrangement designed to satisfy your grandfather's requirements? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. This was the moment Amara had been dreading, when they would have to choose between maintaining their lie and losing everything they'd built together. She felt Jonathan shift beside her, felt him preparing to speak, and suddenly knew with crystal clarity what he was about to do. He was going to tell the truth. All of it. He was going to sacrifice his inheritance, his company, everything he'd worked for, rather than continue a deception that had become unbearable. Before he could speak, before he could destroy himself to protect her, Amara reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. The touch was electric, just as it had been that first day in his office, but now it carried the weight of everything they'd discovered about each other. Jonathan's eyes found hers, and in them she saw surprise, gratitude, and something that looked very much like love. Mr. Blackstone, she said, her voice steady despite the fact that her heart was pounding like a drum, you're asking the wrong question. Excuse me. Amara stood, Jonathan's hand still clasped in hers, and faced the 12 people who held their future in their hands. You're asking whether our marriage began as a business arrangement. But that's not what matters. What matters is what it became. She could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way everyone leaned forward slightly, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. Yes, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. We married for practical reasons. My foundation was failing, his inheritance required marriage, and we thought we could help each other solve our problems with a simple business transaction. Jonathan's hand tightened around hers, but he didn't try to stop her. She could see the pride in his eyes, the wonder at watching her fight for them both. But somewhere between the contract signing and this morning, something extraordinary happened. I fell in love with my husband. The words rang out across the boardroom like a bell, pure and true and impossible to doubt. Several board members glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something approaching curiosity. Not with his money, Amara continued, her eyes never leaving Blackstone's face. Not with his status or his penthouse or his ability to fund my foundation. I fell in love with the man who asks about my day and remembers the names of the families we help. I fell in love with someone who spent his entire life protecting himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, but who chose to trust me anyway. She turned to look at Jonathan, and what she saw in his face nearly undid her completely. Wonder, love, and a hope so fragile it was almost painful to witness. And I fell in love with a woman who makes homemade pasta and covers her office walls with children's artwork, he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Someone who chose to save strangers instead of herself, who saw past everything I've spent years building around my heart. The board members were silent now, watching this revelation unfold with the fascination of people witnessing something they'd never expected to see in a Sterling Industries conference room. Jonathan stood, still holding Amara's hand, and addressed the board directly. You want to know if our marriage is legitimate? It's the most legitimate thing I've ever done. Not because of how it started, but because of what it became when we stopped pretending and started choosing each other. That's a beautiful sentiment, Patricia Webb said, her voice softer than it had been before. But it doesn't change the fact that you entered this marriage for financial reasons. No, Jonathan replied, it doesn't. But it changes everything else. He moved closer to Amara, and suddenly she was remembering their wedding day, the moment when his lips had touched hers and the world had shifted on its axis. She was remembering their first dinner together, the vulnerability in his voice when he'd admitted he didn't know what comfort food tasted like. She was remembering this morning in the kitchen, when he'd looked at her like she was the answer to prayers he'd been afraid to voice. I inherited my grandfather's money, Jonathan continued, his eyes locked on Amara's face. But she inherited my heart. And if I have to choose between the two. He reached up with his free hand, cupping her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. The boardroom, the watching faces, the billions of dollars at stake, all of it faded away until there was nothing but this man and this moment and the choice he was making in front of everyone who mattered to his career. The money can go to charity, he said simply. I choose her. Amara's vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for 6 weeks. This was Jonathan Sterling, the man who'd built an empire on careful calculations and emotional distance, choosing love over logic. Choosing her over everything else he'd ever wanted. Jonathan, she whispered. But before she could say anything else, his thumb traced along her cheekbone in a gesture that had become heartbreakingly familiar. I love you, Amara Washington Sterling, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. Not my wife by contract, but my wife by choice. The woman who taught me that some things are worth more than money. The silence that followed was deafening. 12 board members sat frozen, witnessing something they'd never expected to see. Jonathan Sterling, master of the universe, choosing love over leverage. Then, slowly, Harold Rothschild began to clap. The sound was sharp in the quiet room, but it was quickly joined by others. Patricia Webb. Then Robert Blackstone. Within moments, the entire board was applauding, their faces showing something Amara hadn't expected to see: approval, admiration, and what looked very much like relief. Well, Blackstone said when the applause died down, that was certainly not what I expected to hear today. Does it matter? Jonathan asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the fact that he'd just offered to give up everything he'd worked for. Does it change your decision about the trust fund? Blackstone exchanged glances with the other board members, some silent communication passing between them that Amara couldn't interpret. Jonathan, he said finally, your grandfather's will didn't require that you marry for love. It simply required that you marry. The timing, the circumstances, the reasons, none of that was specified in the legal documents. Amara felt her heart stop. After everything they'd just confessed, everything they'd risked, was he saying that their original arrangement would have been sufficient all along? However, Blackstone continued, what we've witnessed here today suggests that you've satisfied the spirit of your grandfather's intentions, not just the letter of his legal requirements. Harold cleared his throat. Actually, there's something else you should know. I had dinner with your grandfather the week before he died, Jonathan. He told me he wasn't trying to force you into a loveless marriage. He was trying to force you to open your heart to the possibility of love. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Amara could see the shock on his face, the way this revelation reframed everything he'd believed about his grandfather's final manipulation. He said, Harold continued, that you'd spent so many years protecting yourself from being hurt that you'd forgotten how to be happy. The marriage requirement wasn't punishment, it was a gift. A chance to discover what he'd always hoped you'd find. So the trust fund. Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. Is yours, Blackstone confirmed. It was always yours, from the moment you said I do. But what we've seen today suggests that you've gained something far more valuable than money. Amara looked around the boardroom at the faces watching them, these powerful, wealthy people who'd built their lives around profit margins and stock prices, all of them smiling like they'd just witnessed a miracle. Love conquered money, but do you think Jonathan and Amara's journey was worth all the complications? What would you have done in their situation? Share your thoughts below. There's just one more thing, Patricia Webb said, her severe expression softened by something that might have been happiness. We'd like to make the foundation a permanent Sterling Industries initiative. Full funding, complete autonomy, whatever resources you need to expand your programs. The offer hit Amara like lightning. Not just the $100 million Jonathan had promised, but the backing of one of the most powerful corporations in the country. Everything she'd ever dreamed of for her foundation, handed to her by people who'd started this meeting ready to destroy her husband's career. Why? She asked. Because, Blackstone said simply, you've reminded us that the best business decisions aren't always the ones that look good on paper. Sometimes the most valuable investments are the ones we make in each other. As the board members filed out, congratulating them and making plans for foundation partnerships and future meetings, Amara found herself alone with Jonathan in the room where everything had changed. So, she said, trying to process everything that had just happened, we did it. You keep your company, I keep my funding, and nobody has to know we started this whole thing as a business arrangement. Is that what you want? Jonathan asked quietly. To keep pretending. The question hung between them like a bridge to a future she'd never dared to imagine. They could go back to their separate bedrooms, their careful distance, their plans for a clean divorce in 6 months. They could pretend that everything they'd confessed in this boardroom was just performance art designed to save their respective empires. Or they could choose something braver, something that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with the way her heart raced when he looked at her like she was worth more than all his billions combined. No more pretending, she said, stepping closer to him. No more separate bedrooms. No more careful distance. No more protecting ourselves from something that's already happened. Jonathan's smile was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. Are you sure? Because there's no going back from this. If we do this, if we choose each other for real, I'm going to love you for the rest of my life. Promise? She asked, reaching up to cup his face the way he'd done to hers so many times over the past weeks. Promise, he said, and kissed her like a man who'd finally found his way home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Amara pressed her palm against his in the gesture that had haunted her dreams for weeks. Palm to palm, heart to heart, two people who'd started as strangers and somehow become the answer to each other's prayers. So what happens now? She asked. Now, Jonathan said, intertwining their fingers, we go home. We make dinner together. We figure out how to turn your foundation into something that can change the world. And we practice being married to each other for real instead of for show. That sounds perfect, she said, and meant every word. As they walked out of Sterling Tower together, not as business partners or contractual spouses, but as two people who'd chosen love over logic and found it was the best decision they'd ever made, Amara thought about the homeless girl she'd been, the foundation director she'd become, and the woman she was still growing into. 6 months ago, she would have said that fairy tales didn't exist in the real world, that love was a luxury people like her couldn't afford, that men like Jonathan Sterling were predators who consumed everything beautiful and left nothing but emptiness behind. She'd been wrong about all of it. Love wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, as vital as food or shelter or the air they breathed. And Jonathan Sterling wasn't a predator at all. He was just a man who'd forgotten how to trust his own heart until she'd shown him it was safe to try. That evening, as they cooked dinner together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their unlikely home, Amara watched Jonathan laugh at something she'd said about the board meeting and felt her chest fill with a happiness so pure it was almost painful. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her staring. "Just this. Us. The fact that we're probably the only couple in history who fell in love during their own fake marriage." "Not fake," he corrected, pulling her into his arms. "Never fake. Complicated, maybe. Unexpected, definitely. But never fake." He was right. What they'd built together, first through necessity, then through choice, was the most real thing either of them had ever experienced. More real than his money, more real than her foundation, more real than any of the careful walls they'd built to protect themselves from exactly this kind of overwhelming, transformative love. "I love you, Jonathan Sterling," she said, the words coming easier now that she'd stopped fighting them. "I love you too, Amara Washington Sterling," he replied, and kissed her forehead with the reverence of a man who'd found something he'd never expected to deserve. Outside their windows, Seattle sparkled with the lights of 10 million dreams, but inside their home, their real home, built on pasta dinners and morning conversations and the revolutionary idea that love was worth more than all the money in the world, two hearts that had started as strangers beat in perfect synchronization. The cold CEO had gotten his trust fund, but more importantly, he'd gotten his heart back. The foundation director had saved her programs, but more importantly, she'd saved herself from a life without the kind of love that made everything else seem small by comparison. And if sometimes, late at night when they were curled together in the bedroom that was no longer his or hers but theirs, they marveled at the fact that their greatest lie had become their greatest truth, well, that was just one more beautiful contradiction in a love story that had never followed any rules except the ones they wrote together. Money, they'd learned, could buy many things. But it couldn't buy the way Jonathan looked at Amara when she laughed. It couldn't buy the peace that settled over her face when she fell asleep in his arms. It couldn't buy the simple, profound miracle of two people choosing each other, again and again, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. In the end, that choice was worth more than all the trust funds in the world.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.